Right, this is one of Mrs. H's psychology videos. It's PSYB3 Cognition and Law, Recovered and False Memory, Prezi, and it's part 1. There'll be 2 parts for this one. This always revolves around this debate. Okay, 2 questions. Is it possible for real memories to have been repressed and then recovered? Okay, and at a later stage then be accessed by a therapist, for example? Or is it possible that these are memories that are false that have somehow been implanted? So what are these memories? Let's define them. It's useful to have these as definitions. So recovered memory is the emergence of an apparent recollection of a childhood event which the person had no previous knowledge, but then suddenly, perhaps again after therapy, they suddenly remember and recall some emotional event. On the other hand, the false memory is a memory of an event which didn't take place, but which is believed to have happened, to have taken place by that individual. Repression, what's this based on? Is it possible that these real memories could actually have been repressed? Alright, and where's this based? This is based on Freud's idea of ego defense mechanisms, that somehow when we've had a very traumatic event, very harmful, it's going to be something that's very emotional, we repress it, we shove it into the unconscious, it's unwanted, and the idea, Freud's idea was that it is possible for you to access those, to bring them up to the consciousness, to recover them. How do we do that? Well, usually with the help of a therapist. What sort of techniques do they use? We'll talk about that later, but we're talking about hypnosis. We also talk about dream analysis and also imagination techniques. Okay, all very subjective, all have difficulties and problems surrounding them, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So, how do we actually go about researching these? How can we research them? Well, we could use lab studies, lab-based. We know there are advantages of that. You guys have got lots of information about that, about the control, replication, etc., the advantages of it. So if we can, we would want to use lab-based research. The thing is, how are we going to do that? This is all about stuff that's in the unconscious. So how would we go about it? Well, Levinger and Clark thought they could. They used emotive and neutral words, as you remember. And words such as, quarrel, anger, for example, versus window, cow, things like that. Participants were given immediate free associations to these negatively charged words and also the neutral words, and then they were given cue words and they were asked to try to recall the associations they had made with those words. And the thing was that the participants took longer to provide associations to the negatively charged words. And interestingly enough, they also had their galvanic skin response measured, and they had a higher GSR to those negatively charged words. But the thing was, the negatively charged words were less well remembered than the neutral words. So obviously, Levinger and Clark were thinking, well, here's some evidence in the lab of repression. Okay, the trouble is there's some problems with this research. First of all, as you can probably guess, it's about words. It's not about terrible events. So therefore, and you should be able to now put in some keywords to develop this point. It lacks what we could say, it lacks mundane realism, it lacks some validity, etc., etc. That's the first problem. Second one, on delayed recall. Others like Parkin found that actually the emotive words were recalled better. So there's a bit of a problem with that research, okay, with Levinger and Clark. So maybe that's not such good research, and obviously if the research isn't great, then it doesn't back up the theory. Okay, so maybe they use real-life case studies. Let's have a look at case study. Williams study, as you know. Okay, what happened in the Williams study? We had 129 participants that were known to experience abuse from the ages of 10 months to 12 years, and they were interviewed 17 years later. The thing is, 38% of them denied being abused. Okay. Problems with the research. Well, does it really show repression? Don't know about you, but if that was me, maybe I wouldn't want to talk to a stranger about something as personal as that. So is it really showing evidence of repression? The other thing, of course, is that some of those participants, when this trauma was supposed to have happened to them, they were very, very young, and their memory would not have even started to be formed. So can we really say that is evidence for repression? The other thing we've got to question is, isn't that the point about repression? Something, a memory is repressed because it's a coping mechanism, supposedly. Alright, and if it comes to the surface, then it's very anxiety provoking, which is the reason why it's repressed in the first place. So, should we really be trying to raise that information? Ethically, is it sound? Is this a good way of investigating? So there are problems with this sort of research. Other things, we've got people like Holmes who investigated repression for 60 years. Right, doing experimental tests on things like repression and different types of memory, but repression in particular. And after 60 years of research, he found no evidence from controlled, objective lab experiments to find any existence of repression. However, we've got to remember that just because we can't find evidence, empirical evidence, doesn't mean it doesn't actually exist. So we do have both sides of the debate, and it's worth putting that in. What about other evidence against it? What about flashbulb memory? Now, what do you remember about flashbulb? Just pause a minute. What do you recall about flashbulb memory? Flashbulb memory, if you know, is a very emotive, very strong memory and recall of detail of some sort of emotional event. Okay. Now, that obviously goes against repression. How does it dispute repression? Well, think about the evidence we've got for flashbulb memory. Empirical evidence. Okay, we've got Malchus research on 16 children who had to witness the awful trauma of seeing a parent murdered. Now, they didn't repress that information. They actually had flashbacks, they had recurring nightmares, and they recalled it in immense detail. So that obviously counters the idea of repression. On the other hand, a little bit of evidence maybe to put in as a counterpoint. When a researcher called Gary asked students if they believed in repression, most people say, yeah, they believe in repression. So maybe we should say, actually, that's a little bit of maybe a kind of common sense versus scientific view. It's a little bit that you could use for that debate as well, for those of you who've covered that area. Okay, so what about false memories? This we'll come on to in part 2. Before we do that though, let's just have a quick look coming on to these therapist techniques. We have a look at these techniques. Other things we'll consider, and we'll cover this also in part 2, but the therapist techniques we need to look at when we're trying to recover these. As we've said, we've got dream analysis, we've got hypnosis, and we've also got imagination techniques. So Poole, a psychologist, found in 1995 a survey of psychotherapists in the US and UK, found that more than 20% of those therapists actually encouraged imagination as a memory technique for clients who couldn't remember being sexually abused. In other words, they were actually encouraging them to use imagination, to imagine that they had been abused. And we know from our own evidence and from evidence like Loftus that once somebody has suggested something and once it is possible to imagine something, it's very difficult for people to actually work out what was imagined, what was real. Okay, if you refer back to the Goff study and the Goff little activity that we did in class. So there are problems with this. We know that these techniques are very subjective and there are issues with it, and we'll discuss those again when we talk about the implanted memories. So you can pause now, just make sure your notes are all up to date, and then if you're interested, go on to part 2, which is the implanted memories, the other side of the debate.